Hello, everyone. Today is January 19, and you're listening to episode 215 of At Percussion Podcast, an episode which will be released on February 6th. With me today are Casey Cangelosi.
It's Bob Marley's birthday today.
The harder they come, the harder they fall, one and all.
It's February 6th. Also Axl Rose, so I feel kind of weird about that.
Well, that's not my world. Bob Marley much closer.
Cancel. Ben Charles. Hi.
Hi, everybody.
I have nothing to say. And of course, our guest for today, the man whose voice you just heard, is Martin Bresnick. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
So for those of you who do not know this man, I'll introduce him as briefly as possible, so it will take about 10 minutes. Martin Bresnick is a professor of composition and coordinator of the composition department at the Yale School of Music. He was educated at the High School of Music and Art at the University of Hartford, Stanford University, and the Academy for Music in Vienna. His principal teachers of composition include György Ligeti, John Chowning, and Gottfried von Einem. Mr. Bresnick has taught at many schools in the US and Europe, including San Francisco Conservatory of Music, Eastman School of Music, New College in Oxford, the Royal Academy of Music in London, among others. And in 2006, Mr. Bresnick was elected to membership of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He has won many, many, many awards, but the ones that you've probably heard of that will ring a bell are a Fulbright Fellowship, the Rome Prize, the Berlin Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, among many, many others, as I said. So, Mr. Bresnick, again, welcome. Tell us, how are you? How has your experience of this year, 2020, been thus far?
So far, so good. I just want to make one little, small correction.
Mm-hmm.
As of about 6-7 months ago, maybe even a little longer, I, with great pleasure, handed over the coordinator of the composition program, a role at Yale, to my younger and very gifted colleague, also fellow Texan for you Longhorns down there, Theofanidis, who is originally from Houston. So Theofanidis is now the official coordinator of the program, and I'm sort of the eminence grise. I'm the aging, wise counselor to the young king.
Why would you want to hand that off? Does it take up a lot of time or something?
It has a significant administrative elements to it, and I've been doing it for at least 30 years, maybe 35, and it just seemed to me that it would make sense for somebody younger with a refreshed view of the thing to come in and do it. And isn't that what your generation wants? Isn't this the okay boomer moment here, where I hand over to the younger? Now he's Generation X probably, but it's almost as good as your next generation.
Your memes. I mean, I think that means you should be the coordinator, but okay.
I'm a coordinator of memes. Actually, I'm not. We have much better meme students now. Unbelievably gifted students who know all about that.
Well, that's fantastic. I do apologize. I must say the Yale schools, we're going to cut this out, but their website does not say that yet.
That is, I'll get on that right away. Someone's not going to survive this. I know people,
The Eastern European mafia will go after them. Well,
yes.
Well, congratulations on passing this roll off.
It was good for me, Ksenia, because there are administrative things to do, and in terms of newer imaginative additions to the program and way to think about the program, at a certain point, I noticed that many of my ideas had to do with how to sustain the good things that we have done over the last X number of years. But I thought, I haven't had an idea for something really new in a while, and that takes younger people in a world that's changed. So it seemed like the right thing to do, and I'm happy to do it. There's still a very collegial program. We have excellent faculty, and everybody loves the program. So I'm confident it will carry on in a good way.
That's fantastic. Ben, you had a question.
Well, yes. So since we're mention it since we're talking about the Yale School of Music. Obviously, one of your colleagues at the Yale School of Music is one of all of our percussion heroes, Robert van Sice, who we were fortunate to speak with several episodes ago at this point. And I know you wrote a double marimba concerto called Grace for Robert van Sice, and I'm sure you've collaborated with him in some other senses. Could you tell us about your collaborations with Robert van Sice, and in particular the Grace concerto?
Yeah, I mean, I had not written very much percussion music up to the point of that concerto. I wrote some smaller things that had percussion parts in them, but one of the great things about Yale School of Music is the Yale Percussion Group, and becoming friendly with Bob van Sice and getting to know his studio was an incredibly exciting thing. I have to say, I mean, the number of wonderful people that have come through the program is just absolutely amazing. And he approached me to do a concerto, which would be performable. He was very concerned, as you're all percussionists, is this correct? Am I all talking a bunch of percussion players? Well, you can imagine if I had written a solo marimba concerto for orchestra, Bob reasoned that that percussion player who's been standing around in the back of the orchestra for all those years would be watching Bob get out in front and play the solo, and there'd be a certain amount of irritation about that. So he said, well, look, why don't we do it this way? Let's do a double concerto and bring that whatever person who's already in the orchestra out front too to play along with me, and that would be a convenient way to do things. And so that it was his idea to do it in that way. It would not have occurred to me, and I didn't think about it in that way, but it was Bob's very useful thought about that. It's still pretty hard to program percussion concertos, as you might imagine. It's not a easy thing to do. But Bob's solution was interesting, and it actually contributed to the way in which the piece is written. So the piece is written in such a way that, as you probably know, the two percussionists are right out in front of the orchestra in a kind of V shape. And it's actually sort of like this if you're looking at it. And the second, the part that Bob played, which is the leading part, is sort of a kind of a controller for the secondary part. That is, the second percussionist, the second marimba, is almost always echoing or reinterpreting something that Bob has already done, the first player has already done. So that became a driving paradigm, a kind of way of my thinking about the concerto as a whole. Yeah, I've had the great pleasure of having wonderful musicians do this, including Svet Stoyanov and oh gosh, for the fellow from Stony Brook, who's now the conductor there.
Eduardo.
Leandro, and most recently Sam and Gugi and Vidanov. And so I'm just waiting for you guys to take it up and give it the proper final treatment that it deserves.
We're going to do it, Ksenia and Ben, and I'm going to play off-stage muted triangle.
That's a good idea because there's no triangle part, but I'll write one for you.
Well, that's the thing about this one. You can ad-lib it. I was going to ask, a lot of composers I often hear asking and trying to investigate how to write for the marimba. And I was listening to the recording of this just before we got started here, and I was just going to ask, what are your thoughts on just, I guess, the instrument in general, what it does well, are some of its pitfalls and challenges, and what are some of its advantages and the like?
Well, I must say, again, without Bob and his studio, I don't know if I would ever have written for marimba, because up to that point, I really didn't have anything for marimba. I've had various kinds of drums and the vibraphone, which is such a typical, go-to instrument for a lot of composers who are writing modern music. Marimba didn't really enter my mind, and I heard Bob play, and I thought, my God, this guy, he makes these inert blocks of wood sound expressively, like a cello or something capable of a really deep and expressive melodic content. And I wanted to capture some of that. So that was very stimulating to me to think about, what about the marimba? How could you write a kind of music for the marimba that would draw out of it, not just the kind of hyper virtuosity that some of my colleagues like to write for, as many notes that you can play at one time as possible. That's not my style as a composer anyway, but with, to elicit this kind of melodic and expressive quality was part of what I wanted to do. So it's in the instrument. It's not cultivated by everybody, but it's certainly cultivated by Bob and a lot of his students. I will say that what's complicated about the marimba is, of course, since this is an idiophone with a bar that when it's struck is not going to produce overtones that are, whole number ratios of the fundamental. You're going to get all sorts of partials that are kind of out of tune with that fundamental. So you'll get this kind of shimmer or buzz, or in some cases even upper partials that are, totally weird, actually. So I had to deal with that, and I, it's something like I had to come to terms with, because pitch means a lot to me, and intonation means a lot to me. So kind of negotiating that kind of sound was a really challenging thing. The other thing, obviously, also is that it doesn't sustain very long. So I got very interested in, and I had long conversations with Bob about, if I have a long note, what do I do? I mean, you have this concept of the roll to extend the note, but the speed of the roll and the repetitions within that, for me, have a consequential sonic feature. And I wanted to, again, this is something you have to negotiate with the marimba. And finally, as Bob did this great demonstration one day for me, he said, pick up, I want you to pick up 4 pencils, I said, okay, but I want you to hold these 4 pencils in your hands, right? And he held them up. He said, now you see, this is not a piano. The space between the bars over here is different than the space of the bars over here. And if I'm going to play a C and a G over here, it's going to look like this. And up here, it's going to look like that. And so that was it seems very obvious to percussionists, clearly, because they know how much running around they have to do to play a marimba down in the lower registers compared to the top. But for composers, we're a strange lot, and we don't learn everything all at once, and that was a very important lesson to learn to write effectively to that instrument.
I think one of those was a pen in your hand. Does it still work?
Yes, with a pen, the sound isn't as good though.
Okay, I figured it's got to be.
Yeah, when it hits the bar. Actually, if I approached the bar with a pen, I think Rob would.
All different.
He'd kill me. I'd be dead. But actually, in Grace, you'll see that there's a choreography, especially in the cadenza in the first movement, that the player has to move up and down the length of the keyboard of the marimba, but they move backwards and forward in kind of in an oppositional way, that for one player, the top of the marimba is facing forward toward you. For the other player, it's back. So there's a lot of actual choreography that I thought about that kind of motion. So that, for example, at the very end of the piece, they all move forward, except that one is playing in the bass and the other is playing in the treble, right? But there's a sense at the final chordal moment in the piece, they're both out in the front of the stage. So that was thought. I actually thought about that.
Cool.
Which is something to think about.
Well, I had a question. Things you were saying reminded me of this, and Casey kind of asked about shortcomings of the instrument. And one of my favorite things is when composers actually exploit a shortcoming. And so, for example, in two fantastic pieces that come to mind are Kevin Putt's And Legions Will Rise and the Bill Kraft Concerto for 4 Percussionists. And in both cases, with the Putts, it's on marimba, and with the Kraft, it's on timpani. But in both cases, you mentioned the short sustain of the instrument. The player plays a pitch, and then another instrument actually picks up that pitch and sort of carries the sustain of the instrument. And we're speaking of exploiting all sorts of possibilities like that. With 2 marimbas, I would imagine there are a lot of ways you can exploit the shortcomings. Did you explore any of those in your work?
Yeah, I did the question of instrumental issues, but not between the 2 instruments.
Okay.
The slow movement, for example, has any number of places where the strings or the woodwinds are carrying forward a melody that was initiated by the marimbas, and they sustain the melody that way. But I was very concerned, honestly, not to turn the marimba into some kind of xylophone. I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with the xylophone, by the way.
There is.
Jamie Dietz. Did you know Jamie before he passed away? This wonderful student of Bob Van Sice. Is that
Not
name?
personally, but I know of him. Yeah.
He played Grace also, but at Carnegie Recital. It must have been at the big hall. But in any case, he played the Bartok concerto for two pianos and percussion, and he played the xylophone part. And I really never realized just how elegant and songful the xylophone could be in the hands of a really very careful and wonderful musician. I mean, it just never struck me. But this is always surprising to me, I must say, if I can just do another excursion for a moment. György Ligeti, who's a terrific musician in every way, he once played the crash cymbal for me, and not from me, but I heard him play it. It was like, oh my God, I didn't think the crash cymbal was anything more than sort of a glorified garbage can. You just whack it, and everything works. But he played it with a certain kind of sound and sonority. It really got into my head. So, yeah, I mean, yes, other shortcomings of the instruments, every instrument is not a complete thing. Every instrument, in a sense, cannot do everything. Each instrument has both its proclivities and the things that it doesn't do as well. And the task, I think, for a composer, and I try to teach my students that, is to make every stumbling block into a stepping stone. Take every shortcoming and turn it into an advantage or a characteristic. And that's I think very important when you confront any instrument. Marimba has its characters, but so does the vibraphone, so does the snare drum, so does the timpani, so does the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, while you're talking to us about your composition secrets, I was going to ask. I listened to two pieces today to get ready, and one was Grace, and the other was Bird as Prophet, and I love them both, and both have very memorable beginnings. The beginnings really stick out in my head. Probably a lot, I don't know, just very easily. And it's probably a really boring composition question that you get all the time, but I'm finding it's something that young people ask a lot. And that is just, how do you start? Or what is your version of answering that? How do you start a piece of music?
Well, I'm very alert to the fact that you never have quite as much audience attention in a blank space as you do at the very beginning of a composition. So there's actually an enormous structural and emotional weight to what happens at the beginning of a piece. You should never overlook that. Whatever else happens, you have to do something at the beginning that's arresting or significant or mysterious or makes you want to hear the rest of the piece. Because if you don't do that, and in a sense, sometimes young composers are very guilty of this. How many orchestra pieces young composers have you heard that begin with a long D note, pedal note that goes on for a long time, this atmospheric thing that takes 2 or 3 minutes to go by? That time, everybody's out the door. Nobody wants to go on with that. So you'll find actually in many pieces of mine, the opening sets the character and invites you to consider the framework of what that piece will be about. So in Bird as Prophet, it's extremely odd because it begins with the violin playing a note that you assume is a single note, but it turns out to be 2 notes moving away from each other, creating these different tones against sustained piano, and that becomes a thematic in the work. It continues into the work as the work goes along. It's also part of a compositional theoretical thing for me, which I'll tell you about it, but if I please don't spread this too widely. I mean, it's kind of secret. I'm going to reveal now about mine. I'm a almost kind of a Brechtian composer. That is, I think that very complicated and very impassioned things can be made with very simple elements. And I really want to take a listener along with me because often telling a story or some kind of musical narrative. And you have to do that, you have to catch the attention and focus of a listener very quickly at the beginning. The great master of this in some ways is Beethoven. You can consider the number of different ways Beethoven will begin a work, and both the brusque or violent ways he begins it, but sometimes the ingratiating, gentle cantabile way, and sometimes the very sly and humorous way. But whatever it is, he's got you bang right at the top. That's also true, I think, of many of the significant figures that I admire. I'm not one that spends a lot of time on introductions and preparations, but if the piece requires it, I will do it. So yeah, that's a kind of compositional thing. It's an answer to your question about why pieces begin the way they do. I mean, I have the disc that you probably, I don't know if you heard the Bird is Prophet as a YouTube thing or on the disc, the Opere della Musica Povera disc.
David
Boland.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's wonderful that David recorded that. And I also urge you to listen to the performance that Ellie Toyota did online with Lisa Moore. I mean, David, they're all spectacular. I have no complaints about any of them. David's is one that he just fell in love with the piece and he really wanted to do it. I never really coached him, but there are other versions where I'm a little bit more on top of it than that.
Gotcha.
But that belongs to a set of pieces called Opere della Musica Povera, and those pieces, 12 of them, they're all designed to have that kind of apparent simplicity at the outset that develops into something much more complicated as they go
on. So Martin, your works are always braided with philosophical or metaphysical or ontological element. And to me, it sparks so many meditations on the meaning of life and values and purpose and what is real and what is not. And they often come sort of married to other existing works of art, right? A Message from the Emperor, which is a Kafka's story, My Friend's Story, inspired by Chekhov's Strakh or Terror, and then when we did Caprichos Enfaticos, the fact that they go together and are performed with Goya's etchings, The Disasters of War. Could you tell us more about this? Are these artistic reactions sort of immediate, urgent? Is it something like you experience another piece of art and then you want to react to it immediately musically, or do you ponder? Do you ever go fishing for another piece of art that might support your idea? How does this work?
That's a very good question. I have a range of pieces that don't do that.
Yes, of course.
But it's true that I'm often stimulated by particularly literary things that are verbal. I mean, the Goya is unusual in the sense that it is a piece of visual art, but it has a very profound subject matter. A lot of visual art is concerned with its own métier more, but Goya really he's a reportage. He wants to tell us something. And very often for me, the politics, both the psychological politics, but also the simple social politics, I have a need to express my feelings about that in some way. And since I am very connected to music as a temporal art, I mean, for me, music unfolds in time, and time, it can tell a story, and I like that. I like that about it. I mean, and I for whatever reason, I think people have responded to those aspects of my work very strongly. So I've been asked often to do more of things like that. I mean, in the two recent works that I did, for the Brentano String Quartet is called The Planet on the Table, my fourth string quartet, is based on poetry of Wallace Stevens, a great American poet, and each of the movements takes up one of the poems as a kind of point of departure. And just the most recent piece, actually, is Well, actually, you'll be amused by this. The most recent piece, bar one, except for one, is a piece called Amending Time. And it's for the Prism Saxophone Quartet. And they are about to premiere it in March. And that is based on Robert Frost's poem Mending Wall. And it's an interrogation of the concept of walls and what they do. And in fact, the Prism, who I had written another quartet for, which has no explicit program, they knew about my other work that had more programmatic literary elements, so they asked me for it. But just to give you an example of what I mean a little further, Ksenia, what I just finished was to make an arrangement, an orchestration of Beethoven's Coriolan Overture. If you don't know this piece, it's a spectacular, 9-minute explosion, expressive explosion. Has a great timpani part, by the way.
I did a report on this piece when I was a student.
Did you? So you know how great it is.
It's great.
Well, what is
the timpani part?
I didn't play.
Say that again, Ben. What would you say?
I said I got to play that timpani part.
Did you? Okay. It's big, and it's big because in a sense, Beethoven lived in troubled political and social times, and he had to adapt to them in various different ways. And I think it's not by chance that some of the figures that strike me most profoundly, William Blake, Francesco Goya, and Beethoven himself, these are all people involved in the revolutionary movements of their time, where the revolutions didn't necessarily succeed, but their profound sympathy for the oppressed and the downtrodden had to survive the reaction that followed the failures of those revolutionary times. And somebody like myself, who was very much involved in the student movements of the 60s, I've had to live through this too. And so I've made these kind of excursions into materials that take up this matter. Coriolan, for me, is one such piece. I mean, if you ever really want to hear a piece that's about some significant political interior struggle that Beethoven wants to exemplify in music, it's hard to find a better version of that than Coriolan, because you cannot listen to that piece without experiencing a tremendous conflict that's going on in that piece. And it's also silence and not silence, and these explosive moments that are just remarkable. And what really stimulated me is that, of course, we're in Beethoven year now. 2020 is 150 years since Beethoven's 250 years, I guess, since 1770 when he was born. So when I was talking to a person who I will not name, and I said to that person, who was a conductor, by the way, and I said, "Wow, I'm looking at this Coriolan. Isn't it fantastic?" And he said, "Oh, it's one of my favorite all-time Beethoven overtures, but, we really can't do it very much." And I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Well, that ending, nobody, the audience doesn't want to go, drifting away like that." And I thought, you fools! Of course that's the way it has to end. It's one of the most expressive and amazing endings in all of Beethoven. I mean, it's a remarkable psychological tour de force at the end, what happens to the subject and how it sort of just it expires. I mean, yeah, well, if the orchestras don't want to do it, I have a sextet now, folks. It's called the Coriolan Overture, arranged by me, and I'm happy about that. So that's the most recent thing. So yeah, I like pieces. There was a prejudice against extra musical content in most of the 20th century, even as early as Hans Slick's, Concerning the Beautiful in Music, the big essay that he wrote. He favored Brahms and Schumann because I think mistakenly thought, well, their music is purely abstract and Wagner is, they're dragons and people with swords. Yeah. It's kind of Game of Thrones kind of a thing. But I've always felt that music can be many things at once. For those people who want to listen abstractly, I think there's plenty in my music to listen to that's abstract. For those people who need a kind of imaginative story to think about, well, okay, you can do that too. That doesn't distress me. I have no resistance to that.
So a follow-up question would be then, when you interpret and when you receive other people's artwork, you look at them also as people who have political and humanistic values that they convey through their work. Now, we've had a couple of weeks ago an episode in which Casey spoke extensively about how Beethoven had a sort of a difficult episode in his life where he was not quite the kindest human being, and so on. I don't know, do you ever get into this kind of internal conflict where you are unable to separate the art from the artist, or maybe their political message, the grand message is good, and you agree with it, but you are aware that personally they're not a good human being? Does that impact you? Do you think that that's relevant?
Well, this is a very fraught question, right? Very difficult question. And Louis Andriessen, who's a friend of mine, Louis once said to me, "Martin, you know how we know we are not good composers?" I said, "Louis, how do we know we are not good composers?" He said, "Because we are too nice." So, so I thought, okay, Louis, well, speak for yourself. Yeah, I mean, it is troublesome. Beethoven was a troubled guy, and he was, everything has a context. So Beethoven behaved badly at more than one time in his life. There's no question about that, and not just in relationship to his nephew Carl, but even some of his most extraordinary, highly spiritualized works, like the Missa Solemnis, he didn't hesitate to sell that piece twice to two different publishers. And he each told each one that it was unique. So, he's a kind of, he wasn't a perfect guy. Mm-hmm. And imagine if you're somebody like myself, of a Jewish background. I teach Wagner. And, Wagner was a notorious anti-Semite and really disgusting. Anti-Semitism is just one of the horrible features of Wagner. I mean, it's just awful. But the music is absolutely amazing. So I remain in a constant dialogue with this. Mm-hmm. I don't give up on either position. Mm-hmm. I try to recognize that humans are human, and some of them are pretty shitty and some of them are not. And, and this, by the way, this is not unique to men. Women also participate in the good and the bad, That's part of the necessary part of the emancipation of the entire human community, is that we recognize we're all bozos on this bus. There's nobody who gets a pass. Everybody, in a sense, has to acknowledge their historical moment and how they respond to that moment. On the other hand, there are perfectly many, many really wonderful people who write terrible music. So you can't, and special pleading doesn't work for me. That doesn't work for me. If your political positions line up completely with mine, that doesn't just automatically grant to me the thing of saying, oh, well, since you've written, with great sympathy about the orphans in Bangladesh, your piece has to be really wonderful. The troublesome thing is, on both ends of the spectrum, art remains really hard. If writing music was easy, boy, it would be easy, but it's not. It's even for the great ones, even for the masters, you have to really, it's hard. It's just hard to do well.
And wouldn't it be so boring if Beethoven's life was just peachy and perfect?
I show me the composer whose life was peachy and perfect. I mean, there are some noble characters that I admire. I mean, Bartók, for one, who's an enormously moral person who took a particularly noble and dangerous position against the Nazis and against the fascists in his own country, and finally really had to leave Hungary in 1939. Or he would have been. He was a Christian. He was born Christian, although he was an atheist. But he would have certainly have been, harassed and made his life made utterly miserable. And he made very, very brave statements about that matter. But he also began, as a pretty simple Hungarian nationalist who loved Hungary more than anything in the world. But he grew. I mean, people grow, people change. When you recognize, when he started to recognize that the music that the Hungarians claimed that as their own was actually made by people in Novi Sad who were Serbs, Croats, or he decided that the Slovaks thought that actually the Hungarians thought that was their tune, but the first that was collected in Bratislava. The people grow, and you always have to keep an open mind about that. So, long answer to your important question is, I cannot significantly resolve it. It's not completely resolvable. One of my great heroes, Bertolt Brecht, he was a horrible person. And he exploited everybody who came anywhere near him. And in fact, he took credit for things that he should, it was absurd. The whole Threepenny Opera, he didn't barely speak a word of English, but the whole Threepenny Opera, his friend, Elizabeth Hartmann, who did speak a very good English, who was German, she should have gotten the credit for that libretto. But it's true, Brecht edited it well and made it into what it finally became. So, we're going to find this over and over and over again. This is a troublesome thing. Cool. It's not anybody who thinks that they've got the last word on this one, you should, give them the old Italian expression, looks like this.
To the listeners, that'll be interesting. They'll imagine something far worse than what you did.
That Italian expression is. Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, what Italian expression is he talking about?
What was that one? Yeah. Without going too much further into this, one of the lessons of my life is that, I started off from a fairly left political position in my family, and people were very, my working class people in the garment area of New York, and very inclined to consider political matters and ideological things very seriously. And then you find out that, actually, it's good to have a good ideology, but it's sometimes more important to be really just a good human being. And you find human beings almost sometimes randomly distributed among the ideologies that you think, you'd think the ideologies would make the person really good, but no. And you think the ideologies would make the person really bad, but maybe not. So you have to grow a little older, and you become a little bit more skeptical about final decisions in that regard. Anyway, that's my political rant for the day.
That's great.
Really lovely. That brought tears to my eyes. Ben, you had...
I've been to Serbia, see, so, we've talked about this. Yeah, and...
permit exists.
And the love and the vitality of that culture, and the love of music and the love of a good time and a good glass of wine is infectious and absolutely wonderful. At the same time, there's some people that really, people are people. Some behave very badly, and sometimes the context makes them behave badly, but sometimes they're bad. They're bad people. They do bad things. Anyway, that's my story. I'm a great admirer of Anton Chekhov, the Russian short story writer and great playwright. And that's why I did set, as Ksenia rightly said, my friend's story, because Chekhov, he was a doctor. So when he looked at people and their behavior, he saw it in the context of their human life, like as animals surviving on the planet. And he saw every kind of thing. And he decided, I think I'll just tell the truth about them, that some of the good ones act badly and some of the bad ones act well. And I think I'll just try to be objective about this as much as I can and give everybody a chance to say their piece. It's hard to achieve, but it's extremely admirable when you can find it.
Ben, I think Ksenia went down in a blaze, so you have to take over.
Yeah, so
Martin
Sure.
took her down.
if I can't make Ksenia cry every time I see her, I know I've failed. I failed. The first time I met her, we started talking about Skardalia and all these places on the Kali Megdan and places in Belgrade, you know. And that was it. She was done, you know. She was finished, you know.
I was, that's true. I immediately started crying, and then you started speaking Serbian, and I was just, what just happened?
Yeah.
In the middle of Miami. Yeah.
There it is. Yeah, there it is.
You touch my soul every time. That's why. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think at least we have souls, my friend. That's the important part, you know. There's some soulless people out there you don't want to have to deal with.
Yeah.
I guess we have to have a backup host
Yeah.
when Ksenia's hosting.
Let me tell you a percussion thing, which I think was interesting, just an anecdotal thing, and then please go on where you want to go. I had this funny thing that happened with Soul Percussion, because they're the ones that actually were the earliest commissioners of the Caprichos Enfaticos. And that we were all out in LA, and we were at some school out there, and we were about to give a performance of it, and they were doing a seminar. And I decided I would go to the seminar and not make a big fuss about it. I wouldn't be the speaker, but I just sit there. And I remember that they were saying, somebody asked them in the audience, well, you know, you've worked with a lot of different composers, and, you know, are they different? Do they approach writing for percussion differently? Do they, you know, what kind of differences? And they said, well, you know, Bresnick, I don't even know if they knew I was there. They said, you know, when Bresnick came in, he had a very specific idea of what each instrument was supposed to do. He was like, so I want a little melodica here, and I want a kind of drum with a tape over it over there, and I want, you know, I made these very, very specific requests of things, and I had a cuica that made a funny kind of fart sound, and you know, these were things that I really had. So I thought, well, you know, that's pretty true. And then they said, well, on the other hand, though, you know, Paul Lansky, you know, he just said, yeah, here's the music. What do you got there? Does that work? Oh, yeah, okay, do that. Okay. I was like, what? How could that possibly be true? I was so amused. I mean, I worship Paul Lansky, by the way. Paul Lansky and I went to high school together. I mean, he's a little older than me. He's older, but when I got to the High School of Music and Art in New York, he was like a huge star. Not only was he a terrific composer, but he was in the same class as Richard Taruskin, by the way. There was another guy who was in my high school. Yeah, I mean, what a high school. And so Paul was also the French horn player de jour. I mean, he's an incredible virtuoso French horn player. He was in the best orchestra at school. We had 4. He was in the top one. And I always really looked up to him. And I still look up to him, honestly. But I was like astonished that, I mean, I even found out from Bob that when Xenakis writes these pieces, he, you know, it's just notation. He gives them to the players. They play it on almost any instruments they want, which for me is like, really? I mean, I can hardly believe it. But look, everybody has their own way, and the results are great. So, you know, go for it. So that's, you didn't ask that question, but I gave you the answer.
Well, speaking of great composers, I think Ben.
Yes, I have a great composer. Martin, sometimes I kind of give a book report on a composer relevant to our guest. Yes. And before we even get into the topic du jour here, there was much discussion on the pronunciation of this composer's name. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what we settled on was György Ligeti.
That's too hard. That's good. That's cool. Good. I like that. That's very good. Okay. It's Ligeti like Ligeti split. It's not Ligeti like spaghetti. He used to do that.
That is literally exactly what I asked our little group chat.
Yeah. But his first name is the challenge.
Yeah, that's challenging. And it's just, you know, I think he himself he was kind of Anglophilic, Ligeti. He liked the English language, and he liked England and America, and I think it wouldn't have disappointed him if it was a little more like George than György, you know, like the Hungarian Georgy.
Gotcha. Okay, well, we'll stick with Ligeti for today.
That we're sure
But
of.
much more problematic, actually, is Janacek, because Janacek, he has, it's Janacek with the long A. I mean, it's a Moravian version of Czech, which you will hear different pronunciations of in the Czech Republic. The Czechs will say it one way, and the Moravians will say it another way because of the dialect there. And so everybody gets all confused about how to say his name.
Well, and then to reduce any further confusion, we're talking about György Ligeti, not his son Lucas Ligeti, who is also a composer and is a percussionist as well.
Yes, that's right.
But we were mentioning a lot of the political stuff, and immediately my mind went to Ligeti, so I figured this would be a good place to move next. So Ligeti was born May 28th, 1923 in Transylvania, Romania.
Yes,
he studied at the Music Conservatory in Cluj, Romania, until he was sent to a forced labor camp. And his parents were sent to Auschwitz, actually, and his mother was the only immediate family member to survive the Holocaust. Following World War II, he resumed his studies at the Franz Liszt Academy of Music, where his teachers included Kodai. He was then artistically repressed in the Eastern Bloc, where they were basically prohibited any communication with all the artistic developments that were happening in the West. In 1956, he fled to Vienna after the Hungarian Revolution was violently suppressed by the Soviet army, and then shortly after that, he left for Cologne. When he was in Cologne, he began to work in avant-garde circles along the likes of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Mauricio Kagel. Eventually, he fell out of the Cologne school, unimpressed with various infighting that was going on. It sounded like everyone wanted credit for being the first or the best at doing something. So at this point, he taught as a guest professor in Stockholm from 1961 to 71. He was the composer in residence at Stanford University in 1972. And in 1973, he was given a professorship in Hamburg. He had many far-reaching areas of interest that he pulled into his composition, including literature, art, architecture, science, and mathematics. He seems like he was especially impressed by fractal geometry. He was also heavily influenced by Conlon Nancarrow when he finally discovered Nancarrow's works. We discussed that with Alejandro Viñao on episode 33, and Nancarrow described Ligeti's, Viñao described Ligeti's music as becoming Nancarrowized. He died on June 12, 2006 in Vienna. His notable works I'd like to mention today, or notable to us in particular, include his Poème symphonique for 100 metronomes, which Casey has done a recording of himself. There's a piece that's not percussion specific, but it's my favorite Ligeti piece I just wanted to mention, called Mysteries of the Macabre, which is, I believe, arias from one of his operas all put together, and that's the one with the... well, if you've seen it, you know, and I'll just leave it at that. And then he has a piece that was written for Amadenda Percussion Group. I won't attempt the, I guess it's Hungarian title, but the English translation is With Pipes, Drums, and Fiddles. Excuse me. Yeah. And that is for percussion quintet, I believe, and soprano. I saw Sandbox Percussion Group perform that, or is it, sorry, quartet, not quintet, perform that 2 years ago, maybe at PASIC. Fantastic, unbelievable piece. There's one part, and I remember that one of the members of the group has just an assortment of multi-percussion, and it's like every other note is on a different instrument, and tambourine, cymbal, woodblock, whatever. He has many notable students. His students include Michael Doherty, who percussionists are probably familiar with from works like his Timpani Concerto, Raise the Roof, Roberto Sierra, who has written for Evelyn Glennie, James Horner, who's a very famous film score composer, and of course, our guest today, Martin Bresnick. So I wanted to ask you, what were your experiences like studying with Ligeti? How did he influence you, and any other interesting information you could pass along?
Oh, gosh. Well, you've done a quick sketch. A couple of just little adds to that. So he's born in a part of what is presently Romania and would be called Cluj, but in his day would have been Kolozsvár, which is the Hungarian name for the town. But it was a largely Romanian area, but also lots of Germans. And the household language of Ligeti was as much German as it was Hungarian. If you go to that region even today, you'll see a very interesting mix of people who all have, different attitudes toward that. And the communities don't necessarily all get along. And Ligeti himself was in a complicated relationship to all the communities, a little bit like Mahler, in the sense that Mahler said, you know, he said he was thrice homeless in the world because he was a Moravian among Czechs and a Czech among Austrians and an Austrian among Germans, and you know this, you know, all these subdivisions affected Ligeti as well. But it also enabled him to, he had access to languages that a lot of, well, somebody like Senya speaks like absolutely uninflected, beautiful English. He also spoke French and German and Italian and Swedish, no less, among other languages, which gave him a very special purchase on that part of the world. His brother, it was his brother as well as his father that was murdered in the Holocaust, and he and his mother were the only two survivors. But as survivors, there was a complex survivor guilt that he experienced, no doubt, and it was his life is a complicated life. It wasn't simple. And it was, you know, one of the paradoxes that he ended up in Germany, of all places, in Hamburg, as a teacher where it's not that he was particularly eager to be in Germany. You know, that was not his, you know, goal to be in Germany. German was really, really, you know, perfect. But he, you know, you can see it. Even now in Germany, he was an outsider of a kind. So that the young German composers didn't necessarily follow Ligeti. And among the people that you mentioned, you didn't mention any Germans. But you could have some Europeans, but they're more like people like Unsuk Chen, who was in the seminar with Ligeti in the 80s, and also the wonderful Danish composer Hans Abrahamsen, who was also very much a figure in that world. But there's a Korean and a Dane, and not so much the Germans, interestingly enough. There's so much to tell. I don't know really where I mean, I studied with Ligeti. He was at Stanford, he was my primary teacher. He signed my doctorate. So I probably one of the only people in the world as a doctorate that's actually signed off on by Ligeti. And he had the seminar, but he picked me out of the seminar, and he made me come over to his house when he lived in Palo Alto. And I would arrive at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I'd be there till midnight, you know, because, you know, he loved to talk, and I loved to talk, and he loved to listen, and I loved to listen. And we just got on we really got on, which was a great privilege for me. The reason that I actually found Ligeti altogether is that my other primary mentor, John Chowning, who, by the way, was a percussionist. I don't know if you know that about Chowning. That was his primary thing. He was a jazz percussionist, and even at Stanford, he still continued to play percussion. And if you know his pieces for computer, you'll know how rhythmically adroit and lively they are. I was working with John Chowning one day, and he said, I got this new score, came in, you might want to have a look at it. And he had to go, and he left it on the table, and it was a score. This would have been in 1967 or 68. There was a score of Atmospheres, which I had never seen anything like it. And I had just started doing computer music, and you know, some of the stuff that John Chowning and I had been struggling with on the computer, there was Ligeti kind of realizing for instruments by his detailed orchestrational breaking down of the strings or canonic parts and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, at that point, I just said, I got to study with this guy. I don't care what it takes to do that. And at that time, the draft was after me, and because the draft it was a Vietnam War period, and I had my deferment was taken away, and that's a whole other story which I'll spare you now. But in the end, I did get a Fulbright, and Ligeti had accepted me as a student in Vienna, and I left to go to Vienna. And when I got to Vienna, I spoke to Ligeti on the phone, and he said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." But he said it with a beautiful Hungarian accent. "Martin, I'm so sorry. Because, Martin, and I have won his scholarship too." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He had gotten a Berliner Künstler Prize, and so he had to take it. And he went in that year that I was there, which would have been 69, 70. He was in residence in Berlin, so I didn't get to study with him at that time. I would have. He did come to Vienna a couple of times, and I did speak to him there, but I didn't actually work with him then. That's when I worked with this guy, Gottfried von Einem, but we'll leave him to the side for the moment. But when I got back to Stanford, Chowning and I said, you know, I wonder if we could get him to come to America. And we did. Obviously, more Chowning than me. I was just a lowly graduate student. He was a faculty member. But when he got to Stanford, he had a seminar, but he quickly picked out me and another guy, and he said, you guys are, I don't want to talk to, I'll talk to all those guys in a group, but I want you to come, you know, and work with me. And at that time, he was working on the double concerto for flute and oboe and orchestra, which was interesting for me because I'm an oboe player. That's my primary instrument. So we talked about oboe playing and so on. But many other interesting things happened. I'll tell you a couple of quick anecdotes, which you'll like. So that year, the Swedish record company called BIS, B-I-S, came out with a recording of a piece called Six Bagatelles for Wind Quintet. And these are actually, these six bagatelles are things that Ligeti had arranged for woodwind quintet that are from his Musica Ricercata for piano, which I hope you will get to know. Some of the Musica Ricercata is in Eyes Wide Shut, the Kubrick movie. Well, okay, if you don't, I'm seeing a lot of blankness there, but it's okay. So Ligeti arranged six of those Musica Ricercata for wind quintet. And what these are pieces that he wrote in the late 40s and early 50s in Hungary. And they sound like neoclassic, you know, updates of Prokofiev and Stravinsky and Bartok. And so I rushed out to get this recording when it first came out, and I was like, all I had known up to then was like atmospheres and the Requiem and you know, some of these very, very avant-garde pieces. This is before the opera you're referring to, the Grand Macabre, from which the Mysterium comes. Ben, that's later. And but I'll tell you a story about that too. And so I got this record, and he said, "Oh, Marty, I don't know if I want you to listen to this music." I said, "Why?" He said, I repressed this music. This music is before I came to the West. I didn't know anything. It's I am very embarrassed about this." And I was like, it's absolutely glorious music. And if you think about it, there's probably not a conservatory in the world right now that there isn't some woodwind quintet playing those six bagatelles.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They play them everywhere. But I thought this music was, I noticed that at that point in 69, 70, to try to approach him about his Hungarianness and about the music that that had stimulated him as a young person, he was still very eager to completely get away from this. He didn't want to be associated with it, because you can imagine being around Pierre Boulez or Stockhausen, that music would have been completely anathema to them. I mean, he would have lost his Darmstadt, you know, Welcome to Darmstadt card. They would have taken it away from him. And at that time, he wasn't yet completely secure enough, interestingly, as to say, yeah, this is the music I used to write, but now I write differently, but still. And in the here's the secret, in the Six Bagatelles, there's a movement that sounds like a Romanian folk song. It goes, dee da da dum, dee da 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 dee dum, dee da 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 da. And Ligeti treats this in this kind of quasi imitative canonic way, which no folk song would ever do. Absolutely gorgeous melody. It's in almost every piece Ligeti wrote after that. It's in the horn trio, it's in the piano concerto, it's in the violin concerto, it's all over, it's in the solo viola piece, which suggests to me that there was some place in his heart, this locked in memory of that beautiful music that he collected, because he went on little folkloristic collecting things like Bartok did. And he couldn't let that out yet. And later it comes out, but it didn't come out for a while. So now I'll tell you the story about what the piece you are interested in, Ben. So when I was working with him, he said, "Oh, Martin, you know, I am so late with this commission." "What commission?" "Oh, the Swedish opera has wanted me to write opera. I want to write an opera based on The Tempest." And I thought, yes, that would be fantastic. I mean, you are the Prospero of music. You could do an incredible Tempest. He said, but Martin, I'm 10 years late. I have already spent all the money. What am I going to do? You know, he was not a good person for getting the music in on time. I can tell you that. 10 years late is a kind of, not all-time record, but pretty close, I would say. And so by this time, he had to give up on the Tempest. He decided to give up, and he turned toward this Michel van Gelderode, the Grand Macabre piece, which eventually took the place of the piece that he was going to write for the Tempest. But if you listen to that piece, the Mysterium, you probably like the part with the auto horns and the fugue for horns, and it's a very clever piece. First of all, it had a much more pornographic character until he edited it. It was totally pornographic. The two leading characters, I can't even say it here on Skype because I get in trouble. You know, I'd be arrested. And so he was persuaded to kind of tone it down. So he did. On the other hand, this was a very difficult time for him because I think, you know, he doesn't have another opera then. That's his only opera. There is no other opera. There are scenes, Aventura and Nouvelle Aventure, which are dramatic scenes, little chamber pieces, but they're not operas. They're just little scenic things. They're very influenced by Kago and a lot of wit. They're very funny. This is very serious in its own comical way and terrifying way. However, to write an opera, you have to let in your whole musical imagination. So Ligeti has passacaglias, he has real tunes come into this as well as everything else. And, you know, the world ends in that opera. I don't know if you've never seen the opera, you'll see that the world actually ends. It's the end of the world that occurs in that opera. And at the very end, when everybody's dead, it seems to be, the male and female characters who had different names in its pornographic one, they come out, they emerge in a love duet at the end. And I think from that period, from about 78 till 82, just about, Ligeti wrote almost no music because he was in a crisis of how to let back into his music his origins, the historical music that he loved, and so forth. So, just to conclude this story, I came to visit him in his home in Hamburg in 1982. When I got there, it's typical Ligeti. He said, Martin, I want to see your music, but I'm very busy now. Please leave me your score. How long are you here in Hamburg? I was there for 3 days. I said, give me your music and come back in 3 days, and then we will talk. So I gave him the music that I had written. Every time I did that, I was like, my heart was in my hand, because he was a tough evaluator. He wasn't an easy guy. And on the other hand, he wasn't mean, but he would say things like, the worst thing he would say to a student was, you know, that is not very interesting. Then you go put a bullet in your head and kill yourself. Or he would say something like, you know, Martin, this music, it is really the scraps from the floor of Darmstadt. We already throw that in the bin. We don't want this anymore. So that would have been terrible if he said something like that. And he never wanted you to write like him. That was another wonderful thing. He never wanted that. Little Ligetis, I don't know. Yeah. So I came back in 3 days, my heart in my mouth, but he made me feel good right away. He really liked the pieces. We talked about them for some time, and he showed me what he was working on. And what he was working on was the first movement. This was in July of 1982. He was working on the first movement of the Horn Trio, which is presumably for Brahms. You know, the Brahms wrote a whole trio, and it says, you know, dedicated to so-and-so in the memory of Brahms. But when I opened it up and looked at the score, I saw from the opening moment that it had nothing to do with Brahms. It actually is a quotation of Beethoven's Lebewohl, or Les Adieux Sonata, you know, farewell. It's going to be da-dum, but it has a tritone, typically Ligeti. And I thought, oh my God, Ligeti, I looked at him, he was not well then. He looked like a wreck, and his house was a mess, and I was really worried about him. And by the way, we spent from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until after midnight talking. But I was really worried about him, and I thought that score, he was trying to tell us that he was done, that he was finished, that he was going to die, that he was sick unto death. And I was very worried about it. And it turned out that he was very unhappy because his mother had just died. And that was the last link that he had with the Hungarian family that he came from. So it was a very touching moment. And of course, that was just the first movement of a piece that was being written to be performed in August. It wasn't ready in July. And it's a piece of such formidable difficulty. I don't know how, when I heard the premiere of the chamber concerto for 13 players, do people know the piece of his? You should. It's really great, great work of his. 13 players, the chamber concerto, it's called. I heard the premiere in Vienna when I was a student, and Friedrich Cherha was conducting it, who was a very well-known Austrian composer and conductor. And Ligeti was supposed to have the whole thing done, but when I heard it only had, 3 movements. He didn't get it done for the premiere. So he's a bad example in that regard. But now I want to tell you 2 things. I want to tell you something else about this. So, first of all, Ligeti is not his actual name. Ligeti is a Magyarization of a German name. In other words, like many Hungarians at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century who had German names, changed their names to Hungarian names. So the librettist of Bartók's opera, of the Hercegvárda, Kecsakalu Hercegvárda, Bluebeard's Castle, his name is not actually Béla Balázs or Balázs Béla as he would have been in Hungarian. His name is actually Bauer, Herbert Bauer, B-A-U-E-R. But like many people, the Ligeti family, to get on better with the Hungarian nationalists, changed his name. His actual family name was Auer, A-U-E-R. His uncle was Leopold Auer, the great violinist, who was the teacher of so many great violinists at the end of the 19th century. So on that side of his family, he had a very significant musical heritage of musicians of enormous significance. I mean, Brahms knew Auer. I mean, this is the kind of level that we're talking about. And then, the final thing I want to say to this, and then we don't maybe have to talk about Ligeti necessarily, but if you want to, we can. I have had lovely conversations with Vignau. He's a pretty hard-headed guy. You're not going to convince him of much of anything. But the idea that Ligeti's music becomes non-Carrowized because of Nancarrow is nonsense. Ligeti was going in this kind of direction long ago. He was just happy to find somebody else doing that too. And he gave Nancarrow a lot of credit. He was very generous about this. It's certainly true. But there's so many other things in Ligeti's music that is not having to do with Nancarrow at all. At all. So let's get a grip here. I mean, Nancarrow, there's a funny, and the anecdote here is very funny. So Ligeti was a little bit like you guys didn't grow up in an era that I did. We had baseball cards, and we would, get basically your favorite Houston Astro player and your favorite Yankee player and your favorite Twins player.
I had basketball cards.
Okay, a basketball card. So
baseball, no.
I don't blame you. So, but for Ligeti, composers, great composers were like, vast cards. So he would say things like, "Oh, Martin, who do you think is the greatest living composer?" And I was like, "Are you really asking me this question, George?" What am I supposed to say? Like, I'm standing next to this guy who probably is the world's greatest living composer. So I said, it's, well, never mind. There's too many other funny parts of that story, but the end of that story is this. So I said to him, I may have been born yesterday, but it wasn't in a barn, as the old expression goes. So I said to him, well, George, if we leave you out of the picture, then maybe I can, we can go on with this question. He said, "Oh, Martin, no, I'm not thinking of me. No, of course not. That's absolutely not." I said, "So, George," I said to him, "who do you think is the greatest living composer?" This was in 1986. And he said, "I think the greatest living composer is Conlon Nancarrow." So I said to him, "Well, in 1986. Nancarrow is a pretty interesting composer. I find it absolutely wonderful, fascinating music. But honestly, the greatest living composer, I mean, almost everything that guy did was for player piano. Let's be real. I mean, and even a lot of the pieces that you know that you hear that are not on the player piano are arranged by other people for instruments using his scores. So I said, I don't know. I mean, the narrowness of it really strikes me. And I said to him, there are two composers I think are absolutely fantastic, and I love them both. One, Chopin, and the other one, Schumann. I think they're both fantastic. But if you cast me away on a desert island, I probably would ask you to give me the Schumann, because there's symphonies, there's piano concerto, there's a cello concerto, there's a concerto for four horns, there's songs, there's chamber music. Chopin is fantastic, the unsurpassed, but it's almost 95% piano music. So he looked at me and he said, well, perhaps Nancarrow is not the greatest living composer. That was the whole experience. But I thought, you put me through this?
It was a short, fleeting thought that...
that reminds me so much of I mean, musicians. We absolutely worship Bach and put Bach on this pedestal as arguably the greatest composer. And then you get Harry Partch, who thought Bach was just the worst ever, ruined music. It's just completely. It's just so funny how counterintuitive that seems. But go ahead. Sorry.
But the important part about that it's interesting is that when somebody really hates something, I think you learn more about the person who is the hater than you do about the thing they hate.
Yeah. Well, and
I mean, I learned more about Harry Partch's limitations as an intellectual from that than he's not going to change my mind about Bach.
Yeah. For me, the interesting thing was hearing his reasons for hating Bach. And I don't hate Bach, but when I hear his, it's an interesting discussion. And when you understand why he disliked Bach, his music makes so much more sense and becomes so much more interesting. And I mean, I think it's kind of silly that obviously it's a silly question, who's the greatest composer? There isn't one. But
Ligeti liked this kind of thing.
Yeah.
He would say things like, there are 5 composers in Europe now. What do you say? Stockhausen, Boulez, Berio, maybe Kagel, and Ligeti. He would do this stuff like this.
Sounds like Steve Jobs. But one thing that so sticks out to me in everything that you just talked about with Ligeti is I teach a music appreciation class, and we go through the sort of what is music discussion, and then it's basically almost like a survey of music history. And when I get to 20th century avant-garde, one of the things that I play for them is the Mysteries of the Macabre, and whether you like it or hate it, it is interesting. There is no, I could play Morton Feldman and I think it's good music, but I think the class would be asleep for it. But Ligeti, whether it bothers you or whether you enjoy it, you cannot take your eyes off of it. It's just so interesting all of the time, I think.
Well, at this stage of my life and my productivity, he never lost touch with his lesson to me, let's put it this way, was always, it doesn't matter how great your ideas are. If your music doesn't have a strong sonic profile, it's worthless. So you can't sell me a piece because you had a great idea. And that's his one lesson to me. One of the most pertinent one was when I brought him my dissertation. I was looking at a section at a bar, and he said, "Martin, why do you write this bar?" And at that time, I was totally into integral serialism. I had looked at Boulez's Third Sonata. I was interested in a lot of things, and I said I had some answer because this is the retrograde inversion, and the time point is the exact moment when the 2 strands of this pattern fall on the same note, and it's all been worked out. And then he looked at me and he gave me a little smile, and he said, "Martin, from now on, you are not permitted to write an ugly bar."
Nice.
And I was completely taken aback because I knew that he didn't mean that there was some sort of abstract standard of beauty that I had to achieve. He was saying, don't attempt to sell me this chicken because you have a recipe for chicken somewhere that you want me to. I have to eat this as a beautiful thing. And he never forgot that. And no matter how difficult that music is, no matter how strange it is in some places, he never loses touch with the significant sonic profile that he is aiming for. So it's going to sound. It's not going to. It's not as though his music is not brainy. It's super brainy. But I have an anecdote. So he came. Little sub anecdote. You see, I can talk about Ligeti probably even longer than I can talk about it myself. But so, and that's a long time, by the way. So Ligeti came to Yale for his 70th birthday. We gave him a big, kind of a party. And before it, he and I went to hear Benoit Mandelbrot talk about fractals, because Mandelbrot, who is the discoverer and the developer of the arithmetic theory, or the mathematical theory of fractals, was teaching at Yale at the time. So Mandelbrot, we went to the lecture, and Mandelbrot talked about the mathematics of fractals. Ligeti was very shrewd about math. He was very scientifically inclined, and he might have, he was interested in this. He read a lot about it. But it was evident that Mandelbrot's understanding of fractals as an aesthetic possibility, both for the visual arts or anything else, was extremely limited. But Ligeti was very excited that Mandelbrot was going to come to his concert after that we did in his honor. So we did the concert in his honor, and we were backstage, and Mandelbrot came over and he shook Ligeti's hand, and they spoke. I think they spoke French. I don't know what language, but they spoke. And then Mandelbrot left, and Ligeti turned to me and he said, "He knows nothing about music. It's terrible. He knows nothing. Nothing at all." So, yeah. So, yeah, and this is a funny thing too. So, I don't know if your audience can't see this, but there's a picture here. Can you guys see this picture?
Yeah.
Oh,
and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see this.
Yeah, you can see this, right? So that's me and the master at the concert there, right? He's called me up to the stage because my second string quartet was performed, which is a piece I wrote in his honor, and he really wanted it. He liked it very much, and he wanted to have me come up and accept applause at the very end of the concert. So he had me come up and shake his hand. And the funny part of this is very typically Hungarian, because he was congratulating me, and due to some very strange thing that happened, we were doing a piece called Lux Aeterna, which is also in 2001. It's the music that you hear sometimes when you see the monolith, but not always. It's very beautiful.
That movie we know.
Yeah. Okay, there you
Eyes
go.
Wide Shut, less smart.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Well, Eyes Wide Shut is not nearly as good a movie, but I had no role in the preparation of that piece or anything else, but the choral director who did the pieces for 16 solo voices, just before the concert, she comes up to me and she says, "Martin, the second alto just got sick and is not going to be there. It's 16 solo voices. I'm going to have to sing that part." And she said to me, would you conduct the piece for us? I was like, oh my God, I'm going to now get up on the stage and conduct this piece with Ligeti in the audience. And I've never conducted this piece. I said, okay. I mean, basically the piece is entirely in 4/4. It's just that there's a lot of very complicated subdivisions. So I said, I'll conduct it. I'll beat time. I'll make the cues and I'll beat time. So I did that. And the piece went off very well. Actually, I thought it was very successful. But in this picture, after Ligeti's called me up to congratulate me for my string quartet, we're bowing and he is saying to me, "Martin, please never conduct my choral music again. Please." He was a very funny guy. I mean, people don't understand that. He had a wonderful sense of humor. And I think in the piece that by Amadinda, 5 strums and fiddles, there's a moment, I think, you know, in that piece where the percussionists all take out these tiny little harmonicas, and they just blow in and out of these harmonicas as tonic, dominant, you know, tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant. And it's the strangest kind of music that you could possibly imagine. And I always like to think that he did this in honor of Pierre Boulez, just to really get under his skin. Dominant, tonic, dominant, you know. I mean, you can imagine Pierre just going,
yep.
You know, rigor mortis affecting him, like, seizing up every bone in his francophone body, you know. The two of them didn't get on very well, by the way, even though they respected each other, particularly Ligeti. You know, Boulez, you got to give him credit. He did not always like what Ligeti was thinking or doing, but he did it. And Ligeti was often very mad at Boulez for various things that Boulez said and did. He didn't, you know, agree with this. Let's put it that way. All right, that's enough about Ligeti.
Just one quick anecdote. You mentioned like he always, you know, the compositional process was important, but also just the sound of it was important. And like, to go back to, we mentioned Alejandro Viñao, that seems to be so much of his philosophy as well. And Viñao talks about, you know, I like serialism and all these interesting compositional procedures, but let's be honest, people connect with rock and roll music, hip hop music. And so he steals, you know, grooves from, you know, rock and hip hop music and puts it in some sort of, you know, odd serialist avant-garde percussion piece. Interesting way of looking at it.
He's a really good composer, Alejandro. I have no quarrel with that. But, you know, he's an Argentinian. This is tough. This is tough. Yeah, I mean, I just saw, what did I see? If you ever see the movie The Two Popes that's just come out?
No, not yet.
There's a moment where the Pope, the current Pope, says to the other Pope, he says, you know, I'm an Argentinian, I'm a Porteño from Buenos Aires. And you know how a Porteño commits suicide, don't you? And the German Pope says, no, how does he do it? Well, he climbs to the top of his ego and he throws himself off.
I know we're trying to get away from Ligeti, but you said so much good stuff and so much confirming stuff. And speaking of Amadinda, we had Zoltan Rotz on the show, and he talked about Ligeti so much, and the same sort of thing about just his interest in science, his interest in history, and how he could just knowledgeably speak for just hours on end and just love to talk. And I just wanted to ask you, how do you explain his symphonic poem for 100 metronomes? Where does that come from? It seems like not like anything else he does.
That was very early. I mean, that's in like 1959, 1960. And there is a strand, which remains a small strand even later in Ligeti, of a purely Dadaistic kind of conceptual, humorous anti-art quality. So you'll find it in that piece. You find it also in the Aventure, things that are just silly. And he liked that. I mean, he liked that. That's why he liked Kagel so much, because Kagel made fun of things. And if you've done, it's very hard to do that piece anymore, the metronomes, because nobody has wind-up metronomes anymore. And otherwise, these metronomes would go on forever, you know. And even when I did it and was done, I asked him about how do you do it? Did you ever? I mean, that score was not actually issued as a score. So. It's only, I mean, I talked to this theorist, David Lewin, about how it was done, because I asked Ligeti personally how it was done. And what he really wanted was, he wanted all the metronomes on stage, and before the audience comes into the room, they're supposed to be set off. So the audience is supposed to come into the room while they're already going. You're not supposed to run around and start them, while they're sitting there. But in practice, what happens, and this has happened when I've done a piece a couple of times, is that because these are such, they're actually instruments made of wood and metal, and they're not so precise. So there's always one of them that just refuses to die. The piece this piece could go on for like 10 minutes, and all the other metronomes have stopped, but there's still one going.
Yeah,
you're hoping that it will finally stop, and it doesn't. It keeps going. Everybody's like, "Oh God." I mean, so this is very early. This is
Cool.
not. I mean, I don't think you can disassociate it from him, but it's a small strand of a much. It's part of his wit. He knew it was funny. He knew it was silly. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Martin, we've had such a wonderful time and so fantastic to listen to you. Just before we wrap up, and again, this is as a nod to this hour and a half and every other time I get to speak to you. I enjoy your storytelling and learning about your life and your impressions on everything about life so much. Will you write an autobiography or a book some way that we can just enjoy and not have to bother you? We can take your verbal testimonies, take them with us on airplanes and train rides and just have your voice. I love that you compose, of course, but you're so obviously a polymath, and the way you verbally structure the word and describe it is so special. Will you please write something?
Well, what I would really like, if honestly, is that you become my amanuensis. You take a recorder and stimulate me to think about these stories, and I'll tell them to you. Because then you'll cry, and I'll say, "Oh yeah, that was a good one." It'll be good. It'll be a good storytelling moment. But the storytelling aspect, I think. So one of my pieces that actually has a lot of percussion in it, I wrote for just to. Egotistically conclude something with something that I did. I wrote for the Zeitgeist ensemble that are resident in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I don't know if you know them, but it's two percussionists and clarinet and piano. They're really very good. I wrote this piece based on Pinocchio. It's called Pine Eyes. It's over an hour long.
We had a question about this piece. So.
Oh, okay. Well,
perfect. Yeah. David Wolf wanted to ask about the percussion writing in this.
Yeah, I mean that is a piece that's in a sense precedes my contact with Bob, and so I think it doesn't have a marimba. It actually has. It does have marimba. It does have marimba. Sorry, it does. It does. It has a marimba and a vibraphone and has a lot of percussion instruments. It also has numbers of kind of sound effects because the concept of Foley. Because I've written film music, right? Yeah. So the idea that you could make a horse sound like, that's just me slapping on my leg, and make something musical out of that was part of this story of Pinocchio, how an inert piece of wood could become a real human, and what that actually means. And so it's over an hour long, and it's a story, and I love that story, and I think. You can make I think of a piece of music, and that's a good example of it because it also has visuals that my brother and sister-in-law made for it, although it can be performed without them. And I narrated it actually all the way. It went over, so there I put myself into the work as a storyteller. I think that a piece of music can be conceived of in a kind of global way, as that is, it can contain multitudes of meaningful relationships. And in that sense, I'm not really a conventional modern composer or modernist. I'm really a throwback in some ways because I aim to make a universe of meaning. And I tell my students this thing, which I find people don't remember. Somebody very famous once said, "My father's house has many mansions." You know who said that? My father's house has many mansions. Well, I'll let you look it up. Who said that? Go look it up, and then get back to me in a minute. Go Google it quickly there. Tell me who said, "My father's house has many mansions."
Casey, are you on it?
The Bible.
Who says it though?
John 14:2.
Yeah, and who is speaking?
Dang it, I don't know how the Bible works.
Jesus. It's Jesus.
I was like, I'm gonna guess Jesus. I was like, it could be either Jesus or Trump, really.
Well, yeah, that is a perverse interpretation. If it's Trump, my God. Yeah. But the idea, but you think about this. I mean, the way it's put is so beautiful in the King James Version of the Bible. My father's house has many mansions, and usually the mansion is the larger structure, but the house is the smaller structure. And I think what is trying to be brought to your attention there is that there are many roads to Jerusalem. There are many roads to salvation. There are many entrances to the great mystery that surrounds us. There's not only one path, there are many paths. And when I write a piece of music, I try to make such a place that has many doors and entrances and windows so that people like Ben and people like Casey and people like Senya, they can find their own way into it. They don't have to be prescribed by a single way of doing it. A good story, I think, a good story is like a house with many mansions.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you so much, Martin. We had a wonderful time talking to you. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Ben. We hope we'll get you on here once more. At least there's so many more topics we could be talking about.
Yeah.
But thank you for finding the time.
Yeah, thank you.
My best to everybody down there in Texas. Yeehaw! Bye, guys.
Bye.